once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest authors are Dr. John and Rebecca Jackson, and the book is The Shroud of Turin, a critical summary of observations, data, and hypotheses. And welcome, Doctor. Great to see you again. Been a number of years.
Yeah.
And Rebecca as well. I think the last time we saw each other, we were having Chinese food about 15 years ago.
Right.
So it's good to have you back here. People saw you were on last fall with Father Mitch Pacwa,
Right.
talking about where the state of the shroud, etc. Let me ask you, Doctor, exactly, let's talk about this book, The Shroud of Turin, a critical summary. What was the idea behind this?
Well, there's an interesting little story that goes to this. This began with our website on the shroud. And the idea was that we felt there was a need to be able to examine various hypotheses that had been advanced, not just by us by any means, but by others in the shroud environment.
Right.
And so the idea was to give a response, a critical analysis, if you will, of these various image formation hypotheses, which can get very technical and very complex.
Right.
So the website was then oriented towards doing that. Well, as time
Let me
went
ask you a
on-
question.
yes.
Why is that important? Why did you find it important to keep that up to date like that?
Because as time goes on, various hypotheses of image formation are proposed to try to explain the shroud in different ways. And if we're going to do science, then you have to use the scientific method to take these hypotheses and then compare those with observational data, which is available in various formats, part of which is our scientific team in 1978.
Right.
To compare the hypotheses, the predictions of the hypotheses to the observations which we think are credible on the Shroud of Turin. And then the idea is when you're testing the hypothesis, and if the hypothesis fails, even if it fails with one match on the observational data, in other words, the hypothesis predicts P, but Q is the observation.
And that's what you have listed out here, all the different variations on how it could be true, and also ones of how people might have faked it, right? You also obviously,
all that, yeah.
As a scientist, you have to be able to, right, Rebecca, put in the other side and show what others have said or tried to do, and at least show where it might be valid and also where maybe it's not as valid. Now, in this particular work, it's the Turin Shroud Center of Colorado.
Right.
Now, is that different? And then there's the Shroud of Turin Research Project. What was the difference between those two?
That's the 1978 group that
Okay.
John led with 40 people in it at Turin in 1978, October 1978. And that 50th anniversary is coming up, or 40th?
The 50th anniversary is this year,
Is this year.
2018.
Right, that's right,
Yeah.
right.
And so
When we're taping the show, right?
Yeah.
it's hard to believe, but
Right,
that's
exactly.
how long
Well,
it's been.
you both look the same, I have to say that.
Oh, thank
well,
you.
Well, you say
Made
here,
my
Doctor,
day.
that we would characterize the critical summary as a living summary of the high points of Shroud research, and you're talking about each new edition will be given a new version, so the idea is when something substantial comes out, there'll be a whole new edition, and if there's something more minor, it'll show up as an addendum like a 4.1 on your website. Is that the idea?
Exactly, and I would like to very much mention that the person involved in putting this all together is taking the data from our Turin Shroud Center of Colorado. This book has been, and the website has been very well reviewed technically, but it's by a man named Bob Siefker, who was our website master and also was responsible. It's a labor of love on his part to put this together.
To put the book together. Now, you say the critical summary uses the following ratings for each item of forensic evidence in 3 different sections. You have Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. You explain what those classes are.
Well, in science, you can't always, and especially with respect to the shroud, you can't, you don't have equal certainty for given types, various types of observational data. So the attempt here was to reflect that in the analysis that follows and goes through in this book.
Right. That one is firmly supported by scientific data. Class 2 would be item requires additional confirming, and Class 3 would be something that is documented or reported but remains disputed by many researchers. And on page 4 and 5 of the book, you kind of show how you demonstrate that, how the data is presented for people to go through. Because this really is a book, right, Rebecca, that somebody, if you want to get every piece of information about the Shroud that's been posited or found over the years, including a wonderful, wonderful historical section.
Oh, yeah.
To be able to basically talk about how it first shows up in 1355, but in many ways your narrative on the historical evidence tends to show that maybe it showed up before that, right?
Right, you get various opinions. Now, this originally, I must, in all fairness, this is on our website. Okay, it's on our website. So people might say, well, why should I pay for something that's already on your website? But I defy anybody to read 174 pages on
a website, right.
Like
people like to have
it's something you hold in your hand, you know.
And the images here
and the images are high definition.
Right.
Licensed high definition.
Whereas on a website that doesn't happen.
Right.
This is something stocking stuffers.
And I know you have this in a couple of places too, but you actually talk about the idea, there's an image on page 15, water in bottom of a jug is theorized to have wicked up the shroud, leaving water stains. So is that an observation of how we believe it was stored for a long period of time?
Right.
Yes. When I early on was thinking about the Shroud, and many of my colleagues the same way, that we see burn marks on the Shroud, but we also see water stains. And my thought was, and many others, that the water stains and the burn marks were correlated at the same event. Well, one of our colleagues in Italy, this was not ours, analyzed just the water stains and showed Aldo Goreschi in Turin. He demonstrated that that's not true. They are not correlated.
So it wasn't like they were trying to put the fire out and water gun on the Shroud.
They're different events. And his thinking, and then we went back on our own way and verified this, and we are in agreement with his analysis. But basically, the Shroud was, it's like the Shroud was kind of rolled.
Okay.
And if it was ranged vertically, then you can explain the water
Collecting like on the bottom or something.
However, and then it wicked into the cloth, and that's what you're looking at. But that sounds very much like the way you do scrolls. For example, the Dead Sea Scrolls were stored this way.
Okay.
And so that could be a very important historical piece of information.
Right, and you also try to show on page 18, there's that image of Christ, and trying to show, I guess, how similar that image of Christ looks to the image that's ultimately revealed on the Shroud. Why did you include that in there? Why is that important?
Because you're talking about the Christ Pantocrator,
which we held in our hands in the Sinai.
Yeah, Rebecca and I went
to Mount Sinai.
Went to St. Catherine's Monastery, and we were actually allowed to study that particular icon right there in the Sinai in Egypt. But it's important because in the first centuries after Christ, Christianity doesn't really know, at least in terms of documented evidence, what Jesus even looked like. Did he have a beard? Did he not? Some portraits would show him beardless, like the Hellenized people of his time. But then eventually that changes, and Christian art then settles on the idea that we today know of Jesus: beard, hair, hairstyle, and so forth. And the Pantocrator, we think, and many think, is part of that
tradition,
coalescing of what Jesus looked like, probably coming from the Shroud.
Okay. Now,
our thought.
you also talk about the Sudarium of Oviedo, which people have heard a little bit about. You say that the Sudarium shares blood stains that can be mapped to the Shroud of Turin. So what is that, and what's its relation, Rebecca, to the Shroud of Turin?
Well, the Spanish Shroud Society in Valencia is especially responsible for it. They have lined up a number of stains from the Sudarium, which doesn't have an image, lined it up with the shroud, and they do the bulk of the work on. We've done three expeditions to Sudarium, but they're the true experts on it. And Lindian.com is their website, by the way. Anyway, so they say they line up pretty well,
Okay. So as far as the shroud, and we can talk a little bit about the carbon dating, but Doctor, who was Secondo Pia?
Secondo Pia was the
Another lawyer.
Another lawyer.
Yeah,
first
attorney's lawyer.
he was the first photographer of the shroud.
Okay.
In May 25th, 1898, he photographed the shroud for the first time. He was at that time using glass plates, which are used to make the photograph. The glass plates have a negative inversion quality where blacks become white, whites become black, negative. And he was expecting the negative to look like the way a normal negative image of a person is, which is rather strange. But that was not the case. He suddenly saw what looked like what we would call a positive, normal, shaded-looking image, and it startled him. And it also startled the world as well, because as this image started to move out, then you have hidden in the Shroud of Turin image this negative quality. And so...
and this would have been the first time anybody ever would have seen it in that way, even for the fact, if that was in fact the Shroud of Jesus and kept, it had not been seen in that stark contrast.
We think so.
Right.
But yet what the significance of that is it started the modern scientific revolution, if you will. It's remained unabated to this very day of science getting interested directly into the shroud. It's because of that Secondo Pia.
He had his detractors too, but bottom line, there's a park named after him in Turin.
Right, okay. So his family is proud of him, I'm sure. The image on the shroud shows a naked, scourged, and crucified man. This is a section on forensics. Forensic calculation, experimental draping of volunteer subjects. The man was approximately 5 feet 10 inches height and weighed about 170 pounds. And the body is anatomically well developed and normal. So Jesus, if that in fact is his shroud, he would be a little taller than most average people would have been around that time, right?
Yeah, but depends. My late grandfather was 100% Jewish, like me, and he was about 5'10" and weighed about that amount.
Yes, and also there was a dig in Israel. It was a mass grave of men coming from the time of Christ. That range was about 5'2" to about 5'11" and a half.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the man of the shroud fits on the tall side.
Taller
of that,
side, but
he wasn't like a giant.
Giant, yeah, wasn't somebody.
By any stretch
of
of
the Semitic
imagination.
people, the Jews are the tallest.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you have in here different things you bring up. The exact cause of death of the man of the shroud is disputed. How is it disputed?
You have an image to look at, but there's also, because you have an image, you can start doing reconstruction experiments. We've done our own set where we had a volunteer to be suspended on a cross, not with nails, padded wrist supports. We had a medical doctor, in fact.
Two medical doctors.
Two medical doctors, one who was to ensure the health of our volunteer, and the other one to help do the experiments. But then we can start to look at how crucifixion, according to what we see on the man of the shroud, was accomplished. And that's pivotal and fundamental to ideas as to how the suffering and ultimately the death was likely to have occurred. And so we've looked at a lot of those.
And you go through a whole bunch of lists. Shroud image shows no evidence that the legs of the victim were broken. The image shows only 4 fingers on each hand. That's been one that I think people tried to say, well, it only shows 4 fingers, but you deal with the one folded under
Right,
in the
right.
palm. Also, sometimes they try and claim that the hands look elongated or don't look. This I thought was interesting. Besides the blood on the shroud is shown to be human blood, the body is in rigor mortis. Okay, so somebody might say, well, if our Lord died, and wouldn't did they wait for the body to go into rigor mortis? Why wouldn't he have risen before his body went
Right.
into rigor mortis?
Well, the rigor mortis is basically a chemical reaction within the muscles that is a totally natural response. The
Right.
point is, Jesus has to be dead in order for the resurrection to make sense.
Right. So
Without
that
re-
reinforces that fact.
Absolutely, and so
Right,
there are
okay.
a number of things on the shroud. The wound in the side is another one that would argue that the man of the shroud was deceased, and that's would be a pivotal point to make when you start looking at the shroud from the bigger picture as how it intersects with Christianity.
Now, you make the statement at the very beginning about the fact the one thing we know absolutely is that it's an artifact, and a human artifact that's here. And then you go into dealing with the fact in the sense that we know there's an artifact there. How did it come to be? That's the question. And you go through the various hypotheses, the painting hypotheses. And I'm assuming as you go through any one of these things, you kind of show how that maybe couldn't be the case. Something called the dusting hypotheses. What's that?
That's a variation of adding color extraneously to make the image on the shroud.
Okay.
Like Dixie does.
Right.
The observation, there are various observations,
Right.
but let me just pick one in
Sure.
particular, just for an example. In Turin, we were able to look at the shroud close up. We had portable binocular microscope, stereo, and we could go anywhere on the shroud. All of us did it. 30 members of our team.
This is back in
did this
78?
in 78.
78.
I did it, others did it. But when you look at the shroud directly, and you're looking at 30 to 60 times magnification, so you're looking at the fibers that are twisted together to make threads. So we're talking something on the order of the size of a human hair, twisted together. What you see is that the image color at that magnification is born individually by the fibers on the shroud. There's no evidence of any kind of cementation between the fibers that you would expect from an added pigment,
Okay.
for example. So that's an observation. It's a critical observation. So when you have a hypothesis that this is the work of an artist or painting using pigments, that is a very stressing condition for that hypothesis. And I would say pretty much it would exclude that as a technique
Okay.
for what we see on the shroud. And then there are other things too besides.
There's the proto-photographic hypotheses and also something called the shadow hypotheses.
Yes. And all these are hypotheses that have been generated by others. We actually, in our scientific studies of the shroud, I think we spend more time trying to disprove our hypotheses than to try to prove them, because
Right.
science is a method, is an organized method of
elimination.
disproving.
And you make that point in the book.
We make
Right.
that
Yeah.
point.
Right, exactly. And on page 87, section 6, rating the image formation hypothesis, you've got a wonderful chart that allows anybody basically to be able to go through the whole list and kind of see in a checklist where it might work and what the issues might be as well.
Yes, and if I might also add that every mark, every tally, if you will, on that chart is backed up by a discussion as to why the mark was given the way it was.
Okay.
So this is not an attempt to say, well, here's some self-proclaimed experts that are going to tell you this and that about the shroud. Rather, science doesn't work that way. You have to back it with observational data and logic that connects the prediction of the hypothesis to that mark. So people can then take this and analyze it themselves.
So
Okay.
glad we wrote this up. To get
Right.
it in paper.
Right.
In paper.
and consolidate all together.
Yeah.
So in 1989, and you've got it here on page 92 and 93, wonderful picture of a wonderful panel there with 1260-1390 exclamation point. What is that about?
That is coming from another scientific study that was performed exactly, and I really mean exactly, 10 years after
Right.
our 1978 testing.
Wasn't around a Fatima feast day? Or
Yes,
something?
that was October 13th, 1988, that picture, by the way.
Right, October 13th, exactly, you're right.
Really?
Correct.
Because-
And
Yeah.
October 13th, 1978 is when we gave our
Right.
press conference that we had done
Yeah,
the
they
studies on the
released the
shroud.
results in February of '89, looks like.
Anyway, the radiocarbon measurement is one that is used archaeologically to try to ascertain, in terms of physics measurements, the age of a given sample. Now, in this case, or in any case, you look at in carbon, you've got what we physicists call isotopes, but if you want to think of it as different flavors of carbon, like flavors of ice cream, that's a sort of a layman's analogy here. But you look at the ratio of radioactive carbon-14 to stable carbon-12, and knowing how fast the radioactive carbon-14 decays relative to the carbon-12, then if you can make the assumption that nothing has intervened to change that ratio other than the natural radioactive decay, then you can argue that because of the carbon ratio, what the age of that sample was when it was taken out of equilibrium with the atmosphere, because it's in the atmospheric carbon dioxide that has the vegetative material, in this case flax, which is a vegetative item, was taken out of equilibrium. So in that case, the date that you just reported, 14th century, is what radiocarbon measurement has ascribed to the Shroud of Turin.
Right.
So one would say, gee, that
Doesn't that take care of everything?
that sort of takes care of everything. We can conclude our interview right now and
Yeah,
go on.
Exactly right.
But it's not anywhere near that simple. In 1978, we have some data, we're going back to some more observations, that were recorded. They are of an archaeological nature. They show fold line patterns that are quite ancient or old.
Right.
For example, one of these goes right through the 1532 fire and intersects it in a way that it was in place before 1532, which is getting close to the carbon-14 date.
Right.
And it shows that the shroud was folded in a way that is remarkably, and I'd say compellingly, consistent with iconographic and a documented discussion of the shroud in Constantinople several
the
hundred
fourth
Right, which is why you-
several hundred years
you
before
show
the
where
radiocarbon date says the shroud.
There may
even
be
existed.
references to it earlier than that,
Yes.
which would show the date. Because you also point out that that there's been obviously many mistakes over the years, dating living snail shells to
Yeah.
be 26,000 years old, dating a one-year-old old leaves is 400 years old, et cetera. So it's not a perfect science, but
Yeah.
I'm also at the same time, you do, and I give you credit for this.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
The late Father Rochelle,
Right.
we met him with
Yeah.
Divine Mercy Chapel over there in Massachusetts.
Right.
And he was talking to us. He said, something, you repeated about what did Father Rochelle say about the carbon dating?
Yes,
This is so
all we did is
relevant.
just drive him from one side from Stockbridge
Yeah,
to
no,
the
I
other.
know,
Yeah.
right, yeah, right,
And we somehow got on to carbon-14 very quickly.
right.
This is
And he says,
interesting.
what really bothers him about it wasn't the science aspect of it, the mathematics and all that.
Yeah.
It's just that he felt that that people were too sure of this
Like that
date.
picture.
And
Right.
he says when you're that sure of
Right.
anything in real life, you run the risk of making a mistake.
Right,
Yeah,
and I
they're
give
just too sure of
you credit for saying in here today, however, we still do not know the
Yeah,
specific
listen.
cause for the anomalous radiocarbon testing results. And you have a whole section here in concluding comments that you can go through and gives you the idea.
Well-
You say the authenticity position, the ultimate weight of Shroud research can only be gathered to support the position that the Shroud is a true instrumental sign. Let me ask you, we're just out of time. What is an instrumental sign?
I don't know.
Well, it's a sign.
Liberal arts.
It's a sign in terms of if this is the burial cloth of Jesus, and
Right.
personally, I think it is when you look at the totality of all the data. But I do it because of science and are looking at the data. But the sign would then be that it could be pointing to a reality bigger than itself.
resurrection
Yes.
of our
Yeah.
Lord. Okay,
And
with that being
which is very important.
With that being said,
obviously.
we're going to have to wrap things up, as they
Yeah.
say. Thank you so much,
Wrap.
Rebecca. Good to
It's
see you
good to
again.
see you
and
again.
Doctor, of course. It's Dr. John and Rebecca Jackson, and the book is The Shroud of Turin, a critical summary of observations, data, and hypotheses. You want to learn about the Shroud, this is the book. Check it out. Available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark. Thanks.